The scream that tore through the stone mansion at 3:47 a.m. was not the scream of a man in physical pain. It was something far more terrifying, the scream of a man who had looked into his bathroom mirror and seen a complete stranger staring back at him. Alexander Stone stood frozen, his hands gripping the marble sink so tightly his knuckles had turned white, staring at a face he couldn't recognize despite seeing it every day for 35 years. "Daddy?" The small voice came from behind him, followed by the patter of bare feet on cold tile. Emma Stone, all of 7 years old with her father's green eyes and her late mother's dark curls, appeared in the doorway wearing pink pajamas decorated with unicorns. Her face was streaked with tears, and her small hands trembled as she reached toward the man who was supposed to be her protector but now looked at her with the blank confusion of a stranger. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "I'm so sorry but I can't." He gestured helplessly at his own reflection, then at the little girl who was watching him with a mixture of hope and heartbreak that no child should ever have to feel. "I don't know who you are." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma's bottom lip quivered, but she tried to be brave, just like her mama had taught her before the angels took her away 2 years ago. "You're my daddy," she said simply, as if saying it could make it true again. "Your name is Alexander James Stone and you're 35 years old and you make buildings and you love chocolate chip pancakes, and you always read me stories before bed." But Alexander just stared at her with those familiar green eyes that now held no recognition, no warmth, no memory of bedtime stories or chocolate chip pancakes or the day she was born. The car accident 3 weeks ago had stolen more than his memories. It had stolen her father and left this confused, frightened man in his place. The mansion around them felt different too, as if the accident had changed the very walls. What had once been a warm family home now felt cold and empty, filled with servants who whispered in corners and a little girl who had to explain to her own father who she was every single day. The grand foyer with its crystal chandelier seemed too big, too fancy, too much like a museum where people looked but didn't touch, didn't live, didn't love. Alexander's hands shook as he tried to remember something, anything, about the beautiful child standing before him. She had his eyes, he could see that much, but everything else was a blank space where his heart should have held 7 years of memories. First steps, first words, birthdays, Christmas mornings, scraped knees that needed kissing better. All of it was gone, erased as completely as writing on a chalkboard. "The doctor said this might happen," came another voice from the hallway. Richard Stone, Alexander's older brother, appeared behind Emma, his hand resting on her shoulder in a way that was supposed to look comforting but somehow felt possessive. Richard was 42, with the same strong jaw as Alexander but darker hair and eyes that seemed to calculate every situation before responding. "They warned us that the memory loss could be extensive." "Uncle Richard says you might never remember," Emma said quietly, not understanding why her uncle's grip on her shoulder tightened when she spoke. "But I don't believe him. Daddies always remember their little girls, right?" Alexander knelt down, bringing himself to Emma's eye level, even though looking at her felt like trying to remember a dream that kept slipping away. "I want to remember," he said honestly. "I want to remember you more than anything in this world, even if I can't remember what this world is supposed to mean to me." The truth was more complicated than either Emma or Alexander understood. The accident hadn't been random and Richard's concern wasn't entirely genuine. But those were secrets buried deeper than Alexander's lost memories, secrets that would take time and the right person to uncover. For now, there was only a man who couldn't remember being a father, a little girl who refused to give up on the daddy she loved, and a house full of shadows where a family was supposed to live. The stone empire that Alexander had built was now being managed by Richard, who assured everyone that he was only looking after his brother's interests. The servants took their orders from Richard now, and even Emma's bedtime routine had changed under his watchful eye. "We need help," Emma announced suddenly, with the decisive tone of someone far older than 7. "Daddy needs someone who knows how to fix broken memories." Richard's expression darkened slightly. "The doctors are doing everything they can, sweetheart. Sometimes these things just take time or—" He paused, letting the unfinished sentence suggest that some things might never be fixed. But Emma Stone was her father's daughter, even if he couldn't remember her, and she had inherited his determination along with his eyes. As she looked at the man who used to tuck her in every night and tell her stories about brave princesses and kind dragons, she made a decision that would change all their lives. She was going to find someone who could bring her daddy back. The next morning brought new challenges as Alexander struggled with tasks that should have been automatic. He couldn't remember how to tie his shoes, couldn't recall his favorite coffee, didn't recognize the photos of him and Emma that lined the hallway. Each forgotten moment was like a small death, killing a piece of the man he used to be. Emma watched from the breakfast room as her father stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as if it were a complicated piece of alien technology. The cook, Mrs. Henderson, tried to help, but Alexander's frustration was growing with each failed attempt to remember something as simple as how he liked his morning coffee. "He used to make me hot chocolate," Emma told Richard, who was reading financial reports at the dining table with the satisfied air of a man whose responsibilities had suddenly expanded. "Every Sunday morning we would make hot chocolate together and plan our adventures for the week." "That's nice, dear," Richard replied without looking up from his papers. "But your father has more important things to focus on now than hot chocolate and adventures." Emma frowned. Uncle Richard had been saying things like that a lot lately, as if the fun parts of her daddy weren't important anymore. But Emma remembered how her father's eyes used to light up when they planned their weekend adventures, how he would drop everything if she needed him, how he never made her feel like business was more important than being her daddy. She missed that man desperately, and she was beginning to suspect that Uncle Richard didn't want him to come back. The second week after Alexander's return from the hospital brought a new kind of pain that cut deeper than any physical injury. Emma sat at the breakfast table, watching the man who looked like her father struggle to butter his toast, his movements uncertain and clumsy. The Alexander Stone she remembered had been confident in everything he did, from running board meetings to braiding her hair. This man moved through the world like he was walking on ice, afraid that any sudden movement might send him sliding into an abyss he couldn't see. "Daddy," Emma said softly, hoping that maybe today would be different, maybe today he would look at her and remember. "Yesterday was Tuesday, so today is Wednesday. On Wednesdays, we always used to have pancake races." Alexander looked up from his toast, his green eyes holding that familiar expression of polite confusion that had become Emma's least favorite thing in the world. "Pancake races?" he asked, as if she had just suggested they fly to the moon. "You would make the pancakes and I would time how fast you could flip them," Emma explained, her voice getting smaller with each word as she realized he truly didn't remember. "The winner got to pick what we watched during movie night. You almost always let me win, but sometimes you would try really hard and win for real, and then you would pick those old movies with singing and dancing." "That sounds—" Alexander paused, searching for a word that wouldn't hurt her feelings. "That sounds like something a good father would do." The words hit Emma like a slap. A good father would do. Not something I did. Not something we did together. Something a good father would do, as if he were talking about a stranger's activities, something he had read about in a book about how families were supposed to work. Richard looked up from his smartphone, where he had been managing what used to be Alexander's business empire. "Emma, your father doesn't need the pressure of trying to remember every little detail right now. The doctors said it's important not to overwhelm him." But Emma had heard the doctors too, and they had said that familiar activities and emotional connections were often the key to recovery. Uncle Richard seemed to have a very selective memory about what the doctors had actually recommended. "I'm not trying to pressure him," Emma said, her 7-year-old voice carrying a dignity that would have made her father proud if he could have recognized it. "I'm trying to help him remember who he is." "Who he is," Richard repeated, setting down his phone with the careful precision of a man choosing his words deliberately, "is a grown man with serious responsibilities. He's the head of a billion-dollar company, Emma. He can't spend his time thinking about pancake races and movie nights when there are important decisions to make." Alexander flinched at the mention of the company, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. The idea of being responsible for $1 billion anything terrified him more than he could express. He couldn't remember how to work the television remote, couldn't recall his own phone number, couldn't even figure out which suit to wear without asking for help. How was he supposed to run a company? "Maybe," Alexander said quietly, "someone else should handle the company for now. Until I'm better." "That's exactly what I'm doing," Richard assured him, but Emma caught something in her uncle's tone that made her stomach feel funny. "I'm taking care of everything so you don't have to worry about it. The board of directors agrees that it's the best solution for now." Emma didn't understand business, but she understood people, and something about the way Uncle Richard talked about taking care of everything reminded her of how the mean girl at school had taken care of Emma's favorite toy by accidentally breaking it and then keeping the pieces. "What about Mrs. Peterson?" Emma asked suddenly. "She used to help Daddy with work stuff. Where is she?" Mrs. Peterson had been Alexander's personal assistant for 8 years, a kind woman in her 50s who always remembered Emma's birthday and kept a bowl of candy on her desk just for Alexander's daughter. Emma hadn't seen her since the accident. "Mrs. Peterson decided to take another job," Richard said smoothly. "She felt it would be too difficult to work with your father in his current condition." But Emma remembered Mrs. Peterson crying at the hospital, holding Emma's hand and promising that everything would be okay, that she would take care of Mr. Stone just like she always had. It didn't make sense that she would just leave. Alexander tried to eat his breakfast, but nothing tasted right. Food that should have been familiar was like eating cardboard. Even worse was the constant feeling that he was disappointing everyone around him just by existing. Emma looked at him with such hope every morning, as if today might be the day he would wake up and be the father she remembered. Richard looked at him with barely concealed impatience, as if Alexander's condition was an inconvenience that was taking too long to resolve. The worst part was the photographs. The house was full of pictures of a life he couldn't remember living. Alexander holding a newborn Emma in the hospital, both of them looking exhausted but happy. Alexander and Emma at what looked like a birthday party, both covered in chocolate cake and laughing. Alexander pushing Emma on a swing set in the backyard, her face bright with joy and trust. In every photo the other Alexander looked confident, happy, like a man who knew exactly who he was and what mattered to him. This Alexander felt like an actor who had been given the wrong script, trying to play a role he didn't understand for an audience who expected perfection. "I should probably go to the office today," Alexander said, though the thought made him feel sick with anxiety. "Try to understand what I'm supposed to be doing." "That's not necessary," Richard said quickly. "I have everything under control. The last thing you need is the stress of trying to jump back into work before you're ready." "But maybe if I saw the office, if I tried to do some of the work, it might help me remember," Alexander suggested. "The doctor specifically said not to push too hard," Richard reminded him. "Stress could make the memory loss worse. You need to focus on rest and recovery, not on trying to force memories that may never come back." Emma's spoon clattered against her cereal bowl. "They will come back," she said fiercely. "Daddy's memories will come back because he's strong and brave, and he never gives up on anything important." Alexander looked at his daughter, this beautiful, determined little girl who believed in him more than he believed in himself, and felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't a memory exactly, but it was a feeling, warm and protective and urgent. Whatever else he had forgotten, whatever else he had lost, he didn't want to lose her faith in him. "Maybe," he said carefully, "we could try some of those things you mentioned. The pancake races. Just to see if anything feels familiar." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Alexander, I really think—" "Just pancakes," Alexander interrupted, and for a moment his voice carried an echo of the authority he used to wield. "How much harm could pancakes do?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning, and Alexander felt that warm feeling in his chest grow stronger. He didn't remember being her father, but maybe he could learn how to be her father. Maybe that was enough to start with. But as Emma bounced excitedly in her chair, describing the proper technique for pancake racing, Richard Stone was already planning how to ensure that Alexander's recovery didn't interfere with the new arrangement that had given him everything he had always felt he deserved. Zara Williams stood at the imposing gates of the Stone mansion, her small suitcase in one hand and a folder of credentials in the other, trying not to let the grandeur intimidate her. She had worked with wealthy families before, but nothing quite like this. The mansion rose before her like something from a movie, all gleaming windows and perfect landscaping, the kind of place where real people seemed too ordinary to actually live. But Zara had learned long ago that money couldn't buy the things that mattered most. Love, healing, genuine connection. Those had to be earned through patience and understanding, not purchased with a credit card. At 28, she had already helped dozens of families navigate the difficult journey of recovery from traumatic brain injuries, and each case had taught her something new about the resilience of the human spirit. The gate buzzed open before she could announce herself, and she walked up the curved driveway, admiring the gardens that were clearly maintained by professional landscapers. Everything was perfect, beautiful, and somehow cold. It reminded her of the fancy hotels where she had cleaned rooms during college, impressive to look at but not places where people really lived. The massive front door opened before she could knock, revealing a stern-faced man in an expensive suit who looked her up and down with barely concealed disapproval. Richard Stone, she assumed, though his greeting was anything but welcoming. "Ms. Williams, I presume," he said, his tone suggesting that her arrival was an unfortunate necessity rather than a welcome development. "I want to be clear from the start that this arrangement is temporary. My brother's condition is delicate, and I won't have him subjected to experimental treatments or unrealistic expectations." Zara had dealt with resistant family members before, but Richard's hostility seemed particularly intense. "Mr. Stone," she replied calmly, "I'm here to provide supportive care and assistance with daily activities. My approach is very gentle and patient-centered. I'm not here to cure anyone or make promises I can't keep. Good, Richard said curtly. Because the last thing Alexander needs is someone filling his head with false hope or pushing him to remember things that might be better left forgotten. The statement struck Zara as odd. In her experience, family members were usually desperate for their loved ones to recover their memories, not concerned about them remembering too much. But before she could ask what he meant, a small voice called out from somewhere inside the house. Is that her? Is that the lady who's going to help Daddy? A little girl appeared at the top of the grand staircase, her dark curls bouncing as she practically flew down the steps. Emma Stone was exactly as beautiful as her photograph had suggested, but there was something in her green eyes that spoke of sadness far beyond her 7 years. You must be Emma, Zara said, crouching down to the child's level as she reached the bottom of the stairs. I'm Zara. I'm very pleased to meet you. Are you really going to help my daddy remember? Emma asked, her voice carrying both hope and the wariness of a child who had been disappointed before. Uncle Richard says maybe his memories are gone forever, but I don't believe that. Daddies don't forget their little girls, do they? Zara's heart ached for this brave little girl who was trying so hard to hold her world together. I'm going to do everything I can to help your daddy, she promised. Sometimes memories need a little extra help finding their way back home. Richard's expression darkened. Ms. Williams, I specifically requested that you not make unrealistic promises to the child. False hope is cruel. I didn't promise a cure, Mr. Stone, Zara replied evenly. I promised to help. There's a difference. Before Richard could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Emma? Who are you talking to? Alexander Stone appeared from what looked like a library, and Zara felt her breath catch slightly. His photographs hadn't captured the vulnerability in his green eyes, the way uncertainty had replaced what must have once been unshakable confidence. He was tall and handsome in the way that successful men often were, but there was something fragile about him now, like a strong building with a cracked foundation. Daddy, this is Zara, Emma announced, grabbing Alexander's hand and pulling him toward their visitor. She's going to help you remember things. Alexander looked at Zara with the polite confusion that Emma had described during their phone conversations. I'm sorry, he said, his voice gentle but distant. I'm sure Emma explained about my situation. I don't remember hiring anyone. You didn't, Richard interjected quickly. This was Emma's idea. I've tried to explain that professional medical care might be more appropriate, but she was quite insistent. Zara looked between the three of them. The little girl whose eyes blazed with determination, the man whose own eyes held no recognition but something that might have been relief, and the brother whose body language screamed territorial protectiveness. The family dynamics were more complicated than she had initially understood. Mr. Stone, she said, addressing Alexander directly, I'm a trained caregiver who specializes in helping people who have experienced memory loss. I'm not a doctor and I can't perform miracles. But I can help with daily activities, provide emotional support, and create a structured environment that might encourage natural recovery. Alexander studied her face, and Zara had the strange feeling that even without his memories, he was still capable of reading people accurately. What does that mean exactly? What would you do? Simple things, Zara explained. Help establish routines that feel comfortable and safe. Work on basic skills that might trigger muscle memory. Create opportunities for positive experiences that might feel familiar even if you can't remember why. Like pancake races. Emma exclaimed. We were going to try pancake races, but Daddy wasn't sure how to make them. Alexander smiled at his daughter, and Zara caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before the accident. I promised her we would try, he said. Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what a pancake race involves. It's easy, Zara said, surprising herself by how naturally she responded. The goal is to see how many pancakes you can flip successfully in a row without dropping one. Emma times you and then you time her. Whoever gets the highest score wins bragging rights until the next race. Emma clapped her hands together. See, Daddy? She knows about pancake races. She can help us remember how to have fun again. Richard stepped forward, his expression stern. Ms. Williams, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Alexander doesn't need help having fun. He needs professional medical care and a structured environment focused on healing, not games and distractions. But Alexander was looking at Zara with something that might have been interest. You've worked with other families like ours? Every family is unique, Zara replied honestly. But yes, I've worked with people who have experienced traumatic brain injuries and memory loss. I've seen remarkable recoveries and I've seen people who never get their memories back but still build beautiful, meaningful lives. The key is focusing on what's possible rather than what's lost. What's possible? Alexander repeated slowly as if testing the words. I like that better than what everyone else keeps telling me about what's impossible. Richard's jaw tightened. Alexander, you shouldn't make any hasty decisions. Your condition requires careful consideration. My condition, Alexander interrupted, and for a moment his voice carried an edge of the authority he used to possess, is that I can't remember my own life. If there's someone who might be able to help me build a new one or remember the old one, I think I should at least give her a chance. Emma looked back and forth between her father and her uncle, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand it completely. But when Alexander looked down at her, his expression softened. What do you think, Emma? Should we give Zara a chance to help us figure out those pancake races? Emma's smile could have powered the entire mansion. Yes, Daddy. I think we should give her a chance to help us figure out everything. And as Zara looked at this beautiful, broken family, she felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had drawn her to this work in the first place. There were mysteries here beyond Alexander's lost memories, tensions that had nothing to do with his accident and everything to do with the man who seemed determined to keep him from recovering. But there was also love, fierce, desperate, unshakable love between a father and daughter who refused to give up on each other. And sometimes, Zara had learned, love was the strongest medicine of all. The kitchen of the stone mansion had never been designed for pancake races. With its marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, and pristine surfaces that seemed to belong in a magazine rather than a home, it felt more like a laboratory than a place where families made memories. But as Zara tied an apron around Alexander's waist and handed Emma a stopwatch, the sterile space began to feel warmer, more alive. The secret, Zara explained, demonstrating with the first pancake, is in the wrist action. You want to flip it high enough to turn over completely, but not so high that you lose control when it comes down. Alexander watched intently, his forehead creased with concentration as if he were learning to perform surgery rather than flip breakfast food. Everything was still so difficult for him, every new skill requiring the kind of focused attention that should have been automatic. But there was something different about his posture today, less defeated and more curious. Like this? He asked, attempting his first flip. The pancake sailed upward, turned over neatly, and landed squarely back in the pan. Perfect. Emma cheered from her perch on a bar stool, the stopwatch clutched in her small hands. That was definitely perfect, Daddy. Alexander's face lit up with a smile that transformed his entire appearance. For just a moment, the worry lines around his eyes disappeared, and Zara caught a glimpse of the confident, joyful man he must have been before the accident. It was the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him. It felt. Alexander paused, searching for the right words. It felt familiar. Not like I remembered doing it before, but like my hands knew what to do even if my brain didn't. That's muscle memory, Zara explained, pouring batter for the next pancake. Sometimes our bodies remember things even when our minds can't access the memories. It's a very good sign. From the doorway, Richard Stone watched the scene with an expression that was difficult to read. He had been finding reasons to check on them throughout the morning, always with some urgent business matter that required Alexander's attention. But Alexander had politely deferred each interruption to focus on pancakes. Alexander, Richard said now, I hate to interrupt, but the lawyers are waiting for your signature on some important documents. The Riverside project needs your approval before. Can it wait? Alexander asked, not taking his eyes off the pan. I'm learning something here. The lawyers are billing by the hour, Richard pressed. And these decisions really can't be delayed much longer. But Emma hopped down from her stool and positioned herself between her uncle and her father with the fierce protectiveness of a much older child. Uncle Richard, Daddy is doing pancake therapy right now. The lawyers can wait. Pancake therapy? Richard's tone was skeptical. That's what I call it, Emma said proudly. Because making pancakes is helping Daddy remember how to be happy. That's more important than boring old papers. Zara hid a smile at Emma's logic, but she could see the child was right. In the past hour, Alexander had relaxed more than she had seen in the 3 days since her arrival. His movements were becoming more natural, his conversation more fluid, and most importantly, he was connecting with his daughter in a way that felt genuine rather than forced. The lawyers can reschedule, Alexander said firmly, surprising everyone including himself with the decisiveness in his voice. This is more important. Richard's expression tightened, but before he could argue further, Mrs. Henderson, the longtime cook, entered the kitchen carrying fresh strawberries from the garden. Mr. Alexander, she exclaimed, her weathered face breaking into a smile. I haven't seen you in this kitchen since. Well, since before Miss Emma was born. You used to love making breakfast on Sunday mornings. Alexander turned toward the older woman, his expression hopeful. I did. Oh yes, Mrs. Henderson continued, setting down the strawberries and moving to stand beside him. You said the kitchen was the heart of any real home, and you wanted to make sure Miss Emma grew up knowing what a real home felt like. You were quite the cook, actually. Made the best French toast I ever tasted. French toast, Alexander repeated slowly as if the words might unlock something. That sounds. I think I'd like to try making French toast. I have everything you need, Mrs. Henderson said warmly. Would you like me to get the ingredients? Yes, Alexander said, then looked at Emma and Zara. Would you like to help me try to remember how to make French toast? Emma's face glowed with excitement. Can we have a French toast race too? I don't think French toast works quite the same way as pancakes, Zara laughed. But we could time how fast you can dip the bread or see who can make the most even slices. As they worked together, something magical began to happen. Alexander's movements became more confident, his conversation more natural. He started humming while he cooked, a soft, unconscious melody that made Emma's eyes fill with tears of joy. You're humming Daddy's song, she whispered to Zara. He always hummed that song when he cooked. He doesn't remember that he's remembering, but he's remembering. Zara felt her own eyes grow damp as she watched this small miracle unfold. Recovery wasn't always dramatic or complete, but sometimes it came in gentle waves, bringing back pieces of a person's essence even when the specific memories remained elusive. What song is it? Alexander asked, not realizing he had been humming. It's from an old movie you and Mommy used to watch, Emma explained. You said it was your wedding song. Alexander's hands stilled for a moment, and Zara saw pain flicker across his features. His wife's death was another loss layered on top of his memory loss, another piece of his life that felt unreachable. Tell me about her, he said quietly. Tell me about your mother. Emma climbed back onto her stool, her expression becoming serious and important as if she were about to share the most precious treasure in the world. Mommy was beautiful and she smelled like flowers and she laughed at all your jokes even when they weren't very funny. She used to say that you were her best friend and her greatest adventure all rolled into one person. She sounds wonderful, Alexander said softly. She was, Emma agreed. But she also said that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted you to be happy again someday. She made me promise that if you ever forgot how to be happy, I would help you remember. The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle sizzling of French toast in the pan. Alexander looked at his daughter with an expression of wonder, as if seeing her clearly for the first time since the accident. You're helping me remember, he said. Not just facts or events but how to feel like myself again. I don't know how to thank you for that. You don't have to thank me, Emma said simply. You're my daddy. Helping each other is what families do. From the doorway, Richard Stone watched this exchange with growing concern. The closer Alexander came to remembering who he was, the more dangerous the situation became. There were secrets that needed to stay buried, truths that could destroy everything Richard had worked so carefully to build. But as he looked at his brother's face, animated with genuine happiness for the first time since the accident, Richard felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been guilt. Alexander looked like himself again, like the confident, loving man who had always made everything seem possible. The man Richard had tried so hard to destroy. The garden behind the stone mansion was Alexander's favorite place, though he couldn't remember why. Something about the combination of earth and growing things, the way the afternoon light filtered through the old oak trees, and the peaceful sound of the fountain in the center made him feel more like himself than anywhere else in the house. It was here that Zara found him most afternoons, sitting on the stone bench with a book he wasn't really reading, just breathing in the quiet. Mind if I join you? She asked, carrying 2 cups of tea from the kitchen where Mrs. Henderson had insisted on preparing proper afternoon refreshments for both of them. Alexander looked up from his book, a thriller he had apparently enjoyed before the accident but now found impossible to follow, and smiled. Over the past 2 weeks, Zara's presence had become the most comfortable part of his strange new world. She never looked at him with pity or frustration, never made him feel broken or incomplete. With her, he could just be whoever he was right now without the weight of everything he couldn't remember. Please, he said, moving over to make room on the bench. I was hoping you'd find me out here. Zara settled beside him, close enough that he could catch the faint scent of her perfume. Something light and clean that reminded him of spring mornings, though he couldn't say why that particular association felt meaningful. She handed him the tea and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Emma play on the swing set that dominated the far corner of the garden. "She's remarkable," Zara said, nodding toward Emma, who was trying to teach herself to do tricks on the swing with the determined focus of someone much older. Most children her age would be falling apart in this situation, but she's holding everything together with pure willpower and love. Alexander followed her gaze, his chest tightening with an emotion he was still learning to recognize as fierce parental love. "She's stronger than I am," he admitted. "Every day she wakes up believing that today might be the day everything goes back to normal. I don't know how she maintains that kind of hope." "Maybe because she sees something the rest of us are missing," Zara suggested gently. "Children often understand healing in ways that adults have forgotten. They don't focus on what's broken. They focus on what's still working." Alexander turned to study Zara's profile as she watched Emma. There was something about her that drew him in ways he couldn't explain. It wasn't just her kindness or her patience, though both of those qualities had become essential to his daily peace of mind. It was something deeper, a sense of recognition that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the way she made him feel like he was worth saving. "What made you want to do this work?" he asked. "It can't be easy coming into broken families and trying to put the pieces back together." Zara was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her teacup for warmth despite the mild afternoon. "My grandmother had Alzheimer's," she said finally. "I was 16 when she started forgetting things, and I watched my whole family struggle with how to love someone who couldn't remember loving them back. It was heartbreaking, but it also taught me that love isn't just about shared memories. It's about choosing to care for someone regardless of whether they can remember why they deserve it." "Did she get better?" Alexander asked softly. "No," Zara admitted. "But she had moments of clarity, times when she would look at me and I could see that she knew who I was, even if she couldn't say my name. Those moments taught me that healing isn't always about getting back what you lost. Sometimes it's about finding new ways to connect." Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea or the afternoon sun. "Is that what we're doing? Finding new ways to connect?" Zara turned to meet his eyes, and for a moment the professional distance she usually maintained seemed to waver. "Yes," she said quietly. "I think that's exactly what we're doing." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities that neither of them was quite ready to name. Alexander found himself studying the way the light caught in Zara's dark eyes, the gentle curve of her smile, the way she seemed to radiate calm even when everything around her was chaotic. He didn't remember falling in love before, couldn't recall what it had felt like with Emma's mother, but he suspected it might have felt something like this. This gradual awareness that someone had become essential to his happiness. "Daddy? Zara. Come push me." Emma's voice carried across the garden, breaking the spell but not dispelling the warmth that had settled between them. "Duty calls," Zara said with a smile that seemed brighter than usual. They walked over to the swing set together, and Alexander took his position behind Emma while Zara settled on the neighboring swing. As he pushed his daughter higher and higher, listening to her delighted squeals, he felt something that might have been a memory tugging at the edges of his consciousness. Not a specific event but an emotional echo, the feeling of being completely, perfectly happy. "Higher, Daddy," Emma called. "Push me to the clouds." "To the clouds it is," Alexander laughed, giving her an extra strong push that sent her soaring. Zara began to swing herself, pumping her legs to gain height, and soon she was flying alongside Emma, both of them laughing like children. Alexander stood back and watched them, these two females who had somehow become the center of his rebuilt world, and felt a contentment that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. "Your turn, Daddy," Emma called as her swing began to slow. "Zara, help me push Daddy super high." "Oh, I don't think," Alexander began, but Zara was already off her swing and moving to stand beside Emma. "Come on," she said, her eyes dancing with mischief. "When's the last time you felt like flying?" Alexander couldn't remember the last time he had done anything just for fun, couldn't recall the last time he had felt carefree enough to be silly. But something about Zara's smile and Emma's excitement made the idea irresistible. "All right," he said, settling onto the swing. "But if I fall off, you're both in trouble." "We won't let you fall," Emma promised solemnly. "Will we, Zara?" "Never," Zara agreed, and the way she said it made Alexander suspect she was talking about more than just swings. They pushed him until he was soaring almost as high as Emma had been, his laughter mixing with theirs in a symphony of pure joy. For those few minutes, suspended between earth and sky, Alexander Stone felt like he was exactly where he belonged, not because he remembered being there before but because being there felt like coming home. From the house, Richard Stone watched the scene through the library window, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. His brother was recovering too quickly, becoming too comfortable, too happy. The bond between Alexander and the caregiver was obvious even from a distance, and Emma's attachment to both of them was creating exactly the kind of stable, loving environment that might encourage Alexander's memories to return. That couldn't be allowed to happen. Richard pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had hoped never to use. "It's me," he said when the call was answered. "We need to accelerate our timeline. The situation is becoming complicated." Outside, unaware of the danger gathering around them, Alexander and Zara and Emma continued to swing and laugh under the afternoon sun, building something beautiful and fragile that would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. As the sun began to set, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber, they finally slowed their swings and sat together on the grass, Emma between the two adults who had become her whole world. "I wish every day could be like this," Emma said sleepily, leaning against her father's shoulder. "Maybe they can be," Alexander said, surprised by his own words. For the first time since the accident, he was beginning to believe that the future might hold possibilities he couldn't yet imagine. Zara watched father and daughter together, her heart full of emotions she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel. She had worked with many families, had helped many people find their way back to themselves, but she had never found herself hoping so desperately for someone's recovery. And she had never found herself falling in love with a man who might not remember her tomorrow. But as Alexander reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently in silent gratitude, Zara decided that some risks were worth taking. Even if Alexander never remembered his past, they were building something new together. Something that belonged entirely to them. The only question was whether they would be allowed to keep it. The nightmare always started the same way. Alexander was driving through rain so heavy it turned the windshield into a river, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the storm. Someone was shouting, angry voices cutting through the sound of thunder, but he couldn't make out the words. Then came the moment of impact, the sickening crunch of metal and glass, and the terrible silence that followed. Alexander woke with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, sweat cooling on his skin despite the warmth of his bedroom. The dreams had been getting stronger lately, more vivid and detailed but still frustratingly incomplete. Dr. Martinez had warned him that as his brain healed, fragments of memory might return in unpredictable ways. Sometimes as dreams, sometimes as sudden flashes during waking hours. But these weren't just random memories. They felt important, urgent, like his subconscious was trying to tell him something his conscious mind wasn't ready to understand. He reached for the glass of water on his nightstand and noticed his hands were shaking. The clock read 3:15 a.m., the same time he'd been waking up for the past week. Something about that time felt significant, though he couldn't say why. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Alexander?" Zara's voice, gentle and concerned. "Are you all right? I heard you cry out." Alexander pulled on a robe before opening the door. Zara stood in the hallway in her pajamas and a cardigan, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking more beautiful than anyone had a right to look at 3 in the morning. "The dreams again," he said simply. "I'm sorry if I woke you." "You didn't wake me," she said. "I was reading. Do you want to talk about it?" Alexander hesitated. He had been sharing pieces of his dreams with Zara over the past few weeks, and she had been helping him try to make sense of the fragments. But tonight's dream had felt different, more real and infinitely more disturbing. "There was someone in the car with me," he said finally. "Someone who was angry. We were arguing about something important, but I can't remember what." Zara's expression grew thoughtful. "Have you mentioned this to Dr. Martinez?" "I have an appointment with him tomorrow," Alexander said. "But Zara, what if the memories that come back aren't good ones? What if there are things I did, things I said, that are better left forgotten?" Zara reached out and touched his arm gently. "Whatever you remember, whatever you learn about yourself, it doesn't change who you are right now. The man I've gotten to know these past few weeks is kind, patient, and devoted to his daughter. That's not something you can fake or forget. It's who you are at your core." Her words eased some of the tension in his chest, but the feeling of urgency remained. "Will you sit with me for a while? I don't think I can go back to sleep right now." "Of course," she said without hesitation. They went downstairs to the kitchen, where Zara made chamomile tea while Alexander sat at the island, watching her move around the space with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. Over the past month, she had become so integrated into their lives that it was hard to imagine the house without her presence. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander said as she handed him a steaming mug. "Anything. Do you think Richard is hiding something from me?" Zara paused, her own mug halfway to her lips. It was a question she had been dreading, because she had noticed the same things Alexander was beginning to see. The way Richard changed the subject whenever Alexander asked about the accident, the way he seemed nervous when Alexander talked about recovered memories, the subtle ways he tried to discourage Alexander's progress. "What makes you ask that?" she said carefully. "Little things," Alexander said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The way he gets uncomfortable when I talk about remembering things. The way he's always trying to handle business matters that I feel like I should be handling myself. And Emma." He paused, as if unsure whether to voice his next thought. "What about Emma? Sometimes I catch her looking at Richard like she's afraid of him. Not the way a child is afraid of getting in trouble, but genuinely afraid. When I ask her about it, she changes the subject." Zara set down her tea, her expression serious. "Alexander, if you're having concerns about Emma's safety—" "Not her physical safety," Alexander said quickly. "Richard would never hurt her. But there's something else, something I can't put my finger on. It's like there's a whole conversation happening around me that I'm not part of." "Have you tried asking Richard directly about the accident?" Alexander nodded. "Every time I bring it up, he says the same things. That I was driving alone, that it was raining, that the police said it was just an unfortunate accident caused by weather conditions. But in the dreams, I'm not alone." Zara leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Alexander, what if your dreams aren't just dreams? What if they're memories trying to surface?" Before Alexander could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Both of them turned toward the sound, and Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair disheveled as if he had just woken up. "I heard voices," he said, his eyes moving between Alexander and Zara with an expression that seemed more suspicious than concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Just couldn't sleep," Alexander said, though he noticed that Richard's arrival had immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. The comfortable intimacy he had been sharing with Zara felt suddenly fragile, interrupted. "The nightmares again?" Richard asked, moving to pour himself a glass of water from the refrigerator. "They're getting more detailed," Alexander said, watching his brother's face carefully. "I'm beginning to remember things about the night of the accident." Richard's hand stilled on the glass, and for just a moment, his carefully controlled expression slipped. Zara saw it too, a flash of something that looked like panic before Richard regained his composure. "Dr. Martinez warned us that recovered memories might not be reliable," Richard said smoothly. "Trauma can cause the brain to create false memories that feel completely real. But what if they are real?" Alexander pressed. "What if there are details about that night that I need to remember? Why would you want to remember something so painful?" Richard countered. "You're finally starting to heal, to build a new life. Why risk that progress by digging into something that might only bring you more pain?" Alexander studied his brother's face, that nagging feeling of wrongness growing stronger. "Because it's my life, Richard. The good and the bad, it all belongs to me. I can't move forward if I'm running from my past." "Sometimes moving forward means leaving the past where it belongs," Richard said firmly. "Dead and buried." The phrase hung in the air like a threat, and Zara felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in Richard's tone, something in the way he looked at Alexander, that made her deeply uncomfortable. "I should get back to bed," she said, standing up and carrying her mug to the sink. "Alexander, try to get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow if you'd like." As she left the kitchen, she heard Richard's voice, low and urgent, saying something to Alexander that she couldn't make out. But the tone was unmistakably that of someone issuing a warning. Back in her room, Zara sat on her bed and tried to process what she had witnessed. Alexander's instincts were right. Richard was hiding something significant enough to make him panic at the thought of Alexander's memories returning. But what could it be? And more importantly, how much danger was Alexander in if he continued to remember? She thought about Emma, about the fear she sometimes saw in the little girl's eyes when she looked at her uncle. What if that fear was justified? What if Richard Stone was more than just an overprotective brother? Zara reached for her laptop and began to search for information about Alexander's accident. The official reports would be public record, and maybe there were details that didn't match the story Richard had been telling. What she found made her blood run cold. The police report mentioned that Alexander's car had shown signs of mechanical failure. Specifically, brake failure that appeared to be the result of tampering rather than wear. The investigation had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the implication was clear. Someone had wanted Alexander Stone dead. And the person who had the most to gain from Alexander's death was his brother Richard, who now controlled the entire Stone empire. Zara closed the laptop with shaking hands, her mind racing. Alexander wasn't just recovering from an accident, he was recovering from an attempted murder. And the person who had tried to kill him was living in the same house, sleeping down the hall, and positioning himself as Alexander's protector and caretaker. She had to warn Alexander, but she also had to be careful. If Richard suspected that anyone knew the truth, he might try to finish what he had started. And this time, Emma might be in danger too. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out her next move, Zara made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't let the man she had fallen in love with remain in danger, and she couldn't let Emma lose her father again. Whatever it took, she was going to help Alexander remember the truth about that night. Even if it destroyed everything they had built together. Emma Stone had always been good at keeping secrets, but this one felt different. It pressed against her chest like a heavy weight, making it hard to breathe sometimes, especially when she watched her daddy and Zara together and saw how happy they made each other. The secret wanted to come out, wanted to be shared, but Emma wasn't sure if telling it would help or hurt the people she loved most. She found Zara in the garden early that morning, sitting on the stone bench with a cup of coffee and a worried expression that had become all too familiar lately. Zara had been different ever since that night when Daddy had the bad dream, more careful around Uncle Richard, more protective of both Emma and her father. "Zara?" Emma approached quietly, the way she had learned to do when adults were thinking about grown-up problems. "Can I tell you something important?" Zara looked up, her expression immediately shifting to the warm, attentive focus that made Emma feel like the most important person in the world. "Of course, sweetheart. You can tell me anything." Emma climbed onto the bench beside her, tucking her legs underneath her the way her mother used to do when they had their special talks. "It's about why I really wanted you to come help Daddy." "I thought it was because you wanted him to remember things," Zara said gently. "That's part of it," Emma said, her voice growing smaller. "But there's another part. A secret part that I haven't told anyone because I wasn't sure if it was true or if I just dreamed it." Zara set down her coffee and turned to face Emma fully, recognizing the seriousness in the child's voice. "What kind of secret, Emma?" Emma took a deep breath, the way her daddy had taught her to do when she had to say something scary. "The night Daddy got hurt, I heard Uncle Richard on the phone. I was supposed to be sleeping, but I got up to get some water, and I heard him talking to someone in his office." Zara's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice calm and encouraging. "What did he say?" He said that he was sorry it didn't work the first time, but that he would make sure there wouldn't be a second chance." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't understand what he meant then, but now I think Uncle Richard did something bad to Daddy's car." The words hung in the air between them, and Zara felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. Emma had known, or at least suspected, that Richard was responsible for the accident. And in her 7-year-old wisdom, she had somehow understood that her father would need protection and care from someone who truly loved him. "Emma," Zara said carefully, "why didn't you tell anyone about this before?" "I tried to tell Daddy once, but he doesn't remember anything, and Uncle Richard is always there when we talk. And I thought about telling the police, but Uncle Richard says children sometimes imagine things, and what if they didn't believe me?" Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But I knew Daddy needed someone who would really take care of him, someone who would love him even if he never remembered being my daddy before." Zara felt tears prick her own eyes as she understood the full weight of what this little girl had been carrying. Emma hadn't just hired a caregiver, she had recruited a guardian angel, someone who would stand between her father and the brother who had tried to destroy him. "Is that why you picked me?" Zara asked softly. Emma nodded solemnly. "I looked at lots of caregiver websites and everyone seemed nice, but when I saw your picture and read about you, something in my heart said you were the right one. Like maybe God knew Daddy needed someone special." "Emma, you are the bravest, smartest little girl I have ever met," Zara said, pulling her into a gentle hug. "And you were absolutely right to trust your instincts. But I need you to know that this isn't your responsibility anymore. You've taken care of your daddy long enough. Now it's time for the grown-ups to take care of both of you. Are you going to tell Daddy what Uncle Richard did?" Zara hesitated. Alexander's memories were returning gradually, and she believed that eventually he would remember the truth himself. But Emma's testimony about the phone call could be crucial evidence if they needed to prove Richard's guilt. "I think we need to be very careful about how we handle this," Zara said. "Your daddy is getting stronger every day and his memories are coming back. I think he's going to remember what happened that night on his own. But until then we need to make sure you're both safe." Emma nodded with the seriousness of someone much older. "Uncle Richard doesn't like you very much. He keeps trying to get Daddy to send you away. Has he said anything to you about that?" He told me that Daddy doesn't really need a caregiver anymore, and that it's not good for him to get too attached to someone who's just doing a job. Emma's expression grew troubled. But you're not just doing a job, are you? You love Daddy, don't you? The question was asked with such innocent directness that Zara couldn't do anything but answer honestly. Yes, Emma. I love your daddy very much. And he loves you too. I can tell because he smiles different when you're around, like he used to smile when Mommy was alive. He's happy again, really happy, not just pretending happy. Tears rolled down Zara's cheeks as she thought about how much this child had endured, how much she had observed and understood while the adults around her struggled with their own problems. Emma, I need to ask you something very important. If your daddy asked me to marry him, how would you feel about that? Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. You mean you would stay forever? You would be my new mommy and we would be a real family again? If that's what you wanted, Zara said softly. If that's what would make you happy. It would make me the happiest girl in the whole world, Emma said, throwing her arms around Zara's neck. I love you too, Zara. I loved you from the very first day because you made Daddy laugh, really laugh, for the first time since the accident. They held each other in the morning sunlight, this woman and child who had found each other across impossible circumstances and discovered that sometimes the most important families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. There's one more thing, Emma said as they finally separated. I've been saving my allowance money and I have almost $200. I want to give it to you so you can buy a really pretty wedding dress when Daddy asks you to marry him. Zara laughed through her tears. Oh, sweetheart, you don't need to do that. But thank you for wanting to. I want to help, Emma insisted. You saved Daddy and now I want to help save you too. Uncle Richard is going to try to make you leave, but I won't let him. Daddy needs you and I need you, and that's more important than whatever Uncle Richard wants. As Zara looked at this fierce, loving little girl who had already sacrificed so much to protect her father, she made a silent promise. Whatever happened with Richard, whatever dangers lay ahead, she would not abandon this family. Emma had fought for her father's life and happiness with the determination of a warrior, and Zara would do the same. We're going to be okay, she told Emma. All of us. Your daddy is stronger than he knows, and together we're going to make sure nothing bad happens to any of us ever again. Emma smiled with the confidence of a child who had learned that sometimes the best adults are the ones who don't just make promises but keep them. I know we will. Because we love each other and love is the strongest thing in the whole world. From the house, Richard Stone watched the scene in the garden through the library window, his expression growing darker as he observed the obvious bond between his brother's caregiver and his niece. The little girl was becoming too attached, too trusting, and Alexander was clearly falling in love with a woman who was nothing more than hired help. It was time to remind everyone exactly who was in charge of the Stone family's future. And if gentle persuasion didn't work, Richard was prepared to use more direct methods to ensure that Alexander never remembered the truth about that rainy night when everything had gone wrong. The storm that rolled in that October evening was fierce enough to rattle the windows of the Stone mansion and send Emma running to find her father. She found him in the living room with Zara, both of them reading by the fireplace, the picture of domestic contentment that had become their evening routine. But as the thunder crashed overhead and lightning illuminated the room in stark white flashes, Alexander's book fell from his hands and his entire body went rigid. Alexander? Zara was beside him instantly, her hand on his shoulder as she recognized the signs of one of his episodes. But this was different from the usual fragments and flashes. His eyes were wide with terror, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow. The rain, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. It's the same rain. Emma crawled onto the couch beside her father, her small hand finding his larger one. Daddy, you're safe. You're here with us. But Alexander wasn't in the living room anymore. He was back in his car, driving through rain so heavy it was like trying to see through a waterfall. And this time the memory was crystal clear. You always thought you were better than me, Richard's voice, sharp with years of accumulated resentment, cut through the sound of the storm. Dad's golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. Well, look at you now, running home to hide behind your lawyers because you can't handle a little family disagreement. Alexander's past self gripped the steering wheel tighter, his anger making him reckless on the rain-slicked roads. This isn't about being better than you, Richard. This is about you embezzling money from the company. Emma's trust fund, the employee pension fund. How could you steal from your own family? I didn't steal anything, Richard had snarled. I borrowed it. I was going to pay it back once the Brazilian deal went through. The Brazilian deal that you knew was fraudulent. The one that would have cost us everything if I hadn't stopped it. Alexander's memory was sharp now, every word of that terrible argument crystal clear. I gave you every chance to come clean to make it right, but you kept lying. So what are you going to do? Turn me into the police? Destroy our family name? I'm going to do what I should have done months ago. I'm going to remove you from the company and make sure you can never hurt anyone again. That's when Richard had lunged for the steering wheel. In the present, Alexander gasped as the full memory crashed over him like a physical blow. The struggle for control of the car, Richard's desperate attempt to send them both over the guardrail, the sickening moment when the brakes failed to respond because Richard had sabotaged them earlier that day as insurance in case his first plan didn't work. He tried to kill me, Alexander said, his voice hollow with shock. Richard tried to kill me, and when that didn't work he sabotaged my car. Zara felt her blood turn to ice, but she kept her voice calm for Emma's sake. Alexander, are you sure? These could be fragments mixing with... No. Alexander's voice was stronger now, filled with a certainty that had been missing since the accident. I remember everything. The argument, the struggle, the moment I realized the brakes weren't working. I remember calling out to God to protect Emma because if I died, she would be left with him. Emma's grip on her father's hand tightened. I knew it, she whispered. I knew Uncle Richard did something bad. Alexander turned to look at his daughter, seeing her clearly for what felt like the first time since the accident. Emma. My beautiful, brave Emma. I remember you. I remember the day you were born and your first word, and the way you laughed when I taught you to ride your bike. I remember all of it. Daddy. Emma threw herself into his arms, tears streaming down her face. You remember me? You really remember? I remember everything, Alexander said, holding his daughter tight while reaching for Zara's hand. Including how much I love both of you. But their moment of joy was interrupted by slow applause from the doorway. Richard Stone stood there, his usually composed demeanor replaced by something cold and dangerous. Very touching, Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I was wondering when those pesky memories would finally surface. Though I have to say, your timing is terrible, brother. Alexander stood up, positioning himself between Richard and his family. It's over, Richard. I remember what you did, and I'm going to make sure you face the consequences. Richard laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. And who's going to believe you? A man who's been having memory problems and hallucinations? A man who's been under the care of a woman who clearly has her own agenda? I'll believe him, Emma said fiercely, standing up beside her father. And I heard you on the phone that night. I heard you say you were sorry it didn't work the first time. Richard's expression shifted, surprise flickering across his features. Well, the little mouse has been listening at keyholes. How inconvenient. You're not going to hurt them, Zara said, moving to stand with Alexander and Emma. I've already contacted the police. They're on their way. No, you haven't, Richard said with disturbing confidence. Because I've been monitoring all the communications from this house. Part of keeping my dear brother safe, you understand. No phone calls have been made tonight. Alexander felt the familiar surge of protectiveness that had defined his life as a father. What do you want, Richard? What I've always wanted, Richard replied. What should have been mine from the beginning. Dad left everything to you, the golden boy, the perfect son. But I'm the one who's been running the company for the past 6 months. I'm the one who's made it more profitable than it's ever been. I deserve to keep what I've earned. By stealing from children and employees? By being smart enough to see opportunities that you were too self-righteous to take, Richard snapped. The Brazilian deal would have made us billions, but you killed it because of some misguided sense of ethics. It would have destroyed innocent people's lives. Sometimes that's the price of success, Richard said coldly. Something you never understood. You always thought you could have everything, wealth, power, love, respect, without making the hard choices. Alexander looked at his brother, this man he had trusted with his life and his daughter's future, and felt a sadness deeper than anger. When did you become this person, Richard? When did you decide that money was worth more than family? The day I realized that family was just another word for the people who get everything handed to them while the rest of us fight for scraps, Richard replied. But it doesn't matter now. You're going to have another accident, I'm afraid. This time all 3 of you. A terrible tragedy, the grieving widower and his daughter and their devoted caregiver, lost in a house fire on a stormy night. You can't be serious, Zara breathed. I'm completely serious, Richard said, pulling out what looked like a small device. The beauty of modern technology is that you can start a fire from anywhere in the house with the right equipment. By the time the fire department gets here, it will be too late to save anyone. Emma stepped forward, her small chin raised with defiance that made her look startlingly like her father. "Uncle Richard, you don't want to hurt us. You're just scared and angry, but you're not really bad. Mommy always said there was good in everyone." For a moment, Richard's expression softened, and Alexander saw a glimpse of the brother he had grown up with, the one who had taught him to ride a bike and helped him with his homework. But then the coldness returned, harder than before. "Your mother was naive," Richard said harshly. "Just like your father. Just like you. The world isn't a fairy tale, little girl. Sometimes the monsters win." "Not tonight," Alexander said firmly. "Not while I have breath in my body." The lights in the house suddenly went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the lightning flashing outside. In the confusion, Alexander heard Zara grab Emma and move toward what he hoped was the back door. But Richard's laughter echoed through the darkness, cold and triumphant. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Richard's voice came from somewhere near the fireplace. "I've been planning this for months, Alexander. Every contingency, every possibility. There's no way out of this house that I haven't already blocked." But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated the power of love to inspire courage, and the lengths to which a father would go to protect his child. As lightning illuminated the room again, Alexander saw his chance and took it, launching himself toward his brother with all the fury of a man who had finally remembered what he was fighting for. The battle for their lives was about to begin. The struggle between the two brothers was brief but intense, years of resentment and betrayal finally erupting into physical confrontation in the flickering light of the storm. Alexander had always been the stronger of the two, but Richard fought with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. They crashed into furniture, sending Emma's drawings and family photos scattering across the floor, the sound of their battle mixing with thunder from outside. "Zara, get Emma out of here," Alexander shouted as he wrestled with Richard for control of the device that could turn their home into an inferno. But Zara had already acted, scooping Emma into her arms and running for the kitchen where she hoped to find another exit. Behind them, she could hear the brothers fighting, and her heart nearly stopped when she heard Alexander cry out in pain. "We have to help Daddy." Emma struggled in Zara's arms, trying to get back to the living room where the sounds of fighting continued. "Emma, listen to me," Zara said, setting the little girl down in the kitchen and kneeling to meet her eyes. "Your daddy is strong and he's fighting to protect us. The best way we can help him is by getting somewhere safe and calling for help." "But Uncle Richard has been watching the phones," Emma said, her voice trembling but determined. "Then we'll have to be smarter than Uncle Richard," Zara replied, pulling out her cell phone. But as she tried to dial 911, she realized Richard had been telling the truth. There was no signal. He had somehow blocked all communication from the house. The sounds from the living room had gone quiet, which was somehow more terrifying than the noise of fighting. Zara grabbed a large kitchen knife from the butcher block, her hands shaking as she tried to decide whether to investigate or continue trying to escape with Emma. The decision was made for her when Alexander appeared in the kitchen doorway, breathing hard and sporting a cut on his forehead, but very much alive. Behind him she could see Richard on the living room floor, unconscious but breathing. "Are you both all right?" Alexander asked, immediately reaching for Emma and pulling her into a fierce hug. "We're okay, Daddy," Emma said, her voice muffled against his chest. "Did you stop Uncle Richard?" "For now," Alexander said grimly. "But we need to get out of here and contact the police. I don't know what other safeguards he might have put in place." As if summoned by his words, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer by the second. Alexander looked at Zara in surprise. "I called them before the phones went dead," she admitted. "When I found the police report about your accident, I called a detective friend of mine and told him about our suspicions. I asked him to check on us tonight." "You've been investigating?" Alexander asked, torn between gratitude and concern for the risks she had taken. "I've been protecting my family," Zara said simply, and the way she said, "my family," made Alexander's heart swell with emotions that had nothing to do with recovered memories and everything to do with the love he felt right now in this moment. The front door burst open, and Detective Maria Santos entered with several uniformed officers, their weapons drawn and their movements precise and professional. "Mr. Stone?" Detective Santos called out. "We received a call about a possible domestic disturbance." "In here," Alexander replied, still holding Emma tight. "My brother is unconscious in the living room. He attempted to murder me 6 months ago, and tonight he tried to kill all 3 of us." As the police secured the scene and attended to Richard, who was beginning to regain consciousness, Alexander found himself telling the story of that terrible night for the first time in its entirety. The embezzlement, the argument, the struggle for the steering wheel, and Richard's backup plan to sabotage the car's brakes. Emma heard him on the phone after the accident, Alexander continued, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. She's been carrying this burden for months, trying to protect me while I couldn't even remember who she was. Detective Santos looked down at Emma with a mixture of admiration and sadness. That was very brave of you, Emma. Would you be willing to tell me exactly what you heard your uncle say? Emma nodded solemnly and repeated the conversation she had overheard, her 7-year-old voice clear and steady as she recounted details that would help convict the man who had tried to destroy her family. As Richard was taken away in handcuffs, he looked back at Alexander with eyes full of hatred and resentment. This isn't over, he said coldly. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've lost. The company will fall apart without me. You'll lose everything. No, Alexander said quietly, his arm around Zara and his hand in Emma's. I've already lost everything once and I survived. I learned that the only things that really matter can't be bought or sold or stolen. You never understood that, Richard, and that's why you'll always be poor no matter how much money you have. As the police cars pulled away and the storm began to subside, the three of them stood together in the doorway of their home, exhausted but safe. Emma looked up at her father with eyes that sparkled with relief and joy. Daddy, now that you remember everything, does that mean Zara has to leave? Since you don't need a caregiver anymore? Alexander looked at Zara, this remarkable woman who had saved his life in more ways than one, who had helped him remember not just his past but how to live in the present. That depends, he said softly. Zara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can answer honestly without worrying about hurting my feelings. Zara's heart began to race, sensing the importance of whatever he was about to say. I've fallen in love with you, Alexander continued, his voice steady and sure. Not because you helped me remember who I used to be, but because you helped me discover who I want to be. I love your kindness, your strength, your courage, and the way you make Emma laugh. I love the way you make our house feel like a home. Tears began to roll down Zara's cheeks as she realized what he was leading up to. I know this is complicated, Alexander went on. I know there are professional boundaries and ethical considerations, and I know you might not feel the same way about me. But I have to tell you the truth, I don't want you to leave. I want you to stay forever, not as our caregiver, but as my wife and Emma's mother, if you'll have us. Emma grabbed Zara's hand with both of her small ones. Please say yes, she whispered. Please stay and be our family. Zara looked at these two people who had become the center of her world, this man who had shown her what it meant to love someone completely, and this little girl who had taught her that sometimes the most important job in the world is simply loving someone enough to fight for them. Yes, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Yes to all of it. I love you both more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone. Alexander pulled her into his arms and kissed her with 6 months' worth of suppressed longing and newfound hope, while Emma cheered and danced around them in the hallway of their home. They had survived Richard's betrayal, Alexander's memory loss, and the long journey back to each other. Now they were ready to begin the next chapter of their lives, built on a foundation of love that was stronger than memory, deeper than blood, and more enduring than any storm. 6 months later, the stone mansion looked entirely different. Gone were the cold, museum-like perfection and sterile grandeur that had characterized Richard's management of the household. In their place was the warm chaos of a real family home, Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, Zara's medical journals scattered across the kitchen island where she studied for her nursing degree, Alexander's business papers mixed with wedding planning magazines on his desk. The garden had been transformed as well. What had once been a showcase of professional landscaping was now a place where Emma's swing set held center stage, where Zara had planted a vegetable garden that produced tomatoes and herbs for their family dinners, and where Alexander had built a gazebo as a surprise for his bride-to-be. It was in that gazebo, on a warm spring morning when the roses were in full bloom and Emma was at school, that Alexander finally asked the question he had been planning for weeks. Zara Williams, he said, dropping to one knee with a ring box in his hands, you saved my life in every way that matters. You brought me back to myself, you gave me back my daughter, and you taught me that love is the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile. Will you marry me? The ring was beautiful but simple, a classic solitaire that spoke of elegance rather than ostentation, chosen because Alexander had remembered Zara's comment that the most meaningful things in life were often the simplest ones. Alexander Stone, Zara replied, tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who had become her everything. You gave me a family when I thought I would always be alone. You showed me that love doesn't always follow the rules, and that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places. Yes, I will marry you. Today, tomorrow, always. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Alexander felt the last piece of his recovered life click into place. He was whole again, not because his memories had returned, but because he had learned that being whole had nothing to do with remembering the past and everything to do with choosing to build a future with the people you love. Emma's reaction to the engagement was everything they could have hoped for and more. When they picked her up from school that afternoon and shared their news, she squealed with delight and immediately began planning what she would wear as the flower girl, what flowers would look prettiest in Zara's bouquet, and whether they could have chocolate cake instead of traditional wedding cake. "Can I call you Mom now?" Emma asked as they sat around the dinner table that night, her small face glowing with happiness. "If you want to," Zara said softly. "But I want you to know that calling me Mom doesn't mean you're forgetting your first mommy. She will always be part of your heart, and that's exactly as it should be." "I know," Emma said with the wisdom of a child who had learned early that love multiplies rather than divides. "But I think she would be happy that Daddy found someone who loves us as much as she did." The wedding planning was a joyful whirlwind that brought out the best in all of them. Alexander discovered that he enjoyed the details and logistics, throwing himself into finding the perfect venue and coordinating vendors with the same attention to detail he brought to his business ventures. Zara found herself overwhelmed by the generosity of Mrs. Henderson and the other household staff, who insisted on helping with everything from menu planning to decoration selection. And Emma appointed herself the chief creative consultant, with ideas and opinions about every aspect of the celebration. They decided on a small ceremony in the garden where they had first begun to fall in love, surrounded by the people who mattered most to them. Dr. Martinez would be there, along with Detective Santos, who had become a family friend during Richard's prosecution. Mrs. Henderson would cater the reception, and Emma had personally designed the invitations with help from her art teacher at school. The only shadow over their happiness was Richard's trial, which had been delayed several times as his lawyers attempted various legal maneuvers. But Alexander had made peace with the fact that justice would take its own time, and he refused to let his brother's continued presence in their lives diminish the joy of building something new and beautiful. "He took 6 months of my life," Alexander said to Zara one evening as they walked through the garden, discussing the upcoming trial. "I'm not going to let him take one more day of our happiness." Richard's conviction, when it finally came, was swift and comprehensive. The evidence was overwhelming, not just Emma's testimony and Alexander's recovered memories, but a paper trail of embezzlement and fraud that Detective Santos and the FBI had uncovered during their investigation. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Alexander felt no satisfaction in his brother's downfall, only a deep sadness for the man Richard had chosen to become and relief that Emma would never have to fear him again. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. Zara had chosen a simple white dress that emphasized her natural beauty rather than competing with it, and Alexander wore a navy suit that brought out the green of his eyes, the same eyes that Emma had inherited, and that had been the first thing Zara had noticed about both of them. Emma walked down the garden path ahead of Zara, scattering rose petals with the serious concentration of someone performing the most important job in the world. She wore a pale pink dress that she had chosen herself, and in her hair was a small clip that had belonged to her first mother, a gesture that brought tears to Alexander's eyes and confirmed that he was marrying exactly the right woman. When Zara appeared at the end of the path, Alexander felt his breath catch. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from being exactly where you belong with exactly the right people. The ceremony was officiated by the pastor from Emma's school, who had counseled the family through some of their darkest days and was honored to celebrate their new beginning. As Alexander and Zara exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to love each other through memory and forgetting, through easy days and difficult ones, through whatever challenges life might bring, there wasn't a dry eye among their guests. "I promise," Alexander said, his voice strong and clear, "to love you not just for who you were when you found us, but for who you become as we grow together. I promise to choose you every day in big ways and small ones, for all the days of my life." "I promise," Zara replied, her hands steady in his as she spoke the words that would bind them together, "to stand with you and Emma as we build something beautiful from the broken pieces of the past. I promise to love you both fiercely and forever, and to never forget that the best families are the ones we choose to create together." When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander kissed his bride while Emma cheered and their friends applauded, it felt like the whole world was celebrating the triumph of love over loss, hope over despair, and the unshakable truth that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the words, "I don't remember but I'm willing to try again." The reception lasted until well after sunset, filled with laughter and dancing and the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something truly beautiful. Emma danced with her new parents, with Mrs. Henderson, and with Detective Santos, who turned out to be surprisingly graceful for such a serious person. Alexander and Zara barely left each other's sides, moving through their celebration in the bubble of happiness that surrounds people who have found their perfect match. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, the three of them sat together on the garden swing that had been the site of so many important conversations. Emma was curled up between her parents, fighting sleep but not wanting the perfect day to end. "Are we really going to live happily ever after?" she asked drowsily. "We're going to work at it every day," Alexander said, his arm around his wife and his daughter. "Happily ever after isn't something that just happens. It's something you build, one day at a time, with people who love you enough to stay even when things get difficult." "Like Zara stayed when you couldn't remember anything," Emma said. "Exactly like that," Zara agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of Emma's head. "And like you stayed brave and strong even when you were scared. We're a team now, the three of us, and teams take care of each other." As Emma finally gave in to sleep and Alexander carried her up to her room, Zara remained in the garden for a moment, looking up at the stars and marveling at the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a single woman with a meaningful career but an empty personal life. Tonight, she was Mrs. Alexander Stone, stepmother to the most remarkable little girl in the world, and married to a man who had shown her that love really could conquer anything. When Alexander returned from tucking Emma into bed, he found Zara still sitting on the swing, her wedding dress spread around her like a fairy tale princess. "No regrets?" he asked, settling beside her and taking her hand. "Only one," Zara said with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "What's that?" "I regret that we can't do it all over again tomorrow," she said, laughing as he pulled her into his arms. "Well," Alexander said, spinning her around in the moonlight while she laughed with pure joy, "we have the rest of our lives to keep falling in love with each other. That's almost as good as doing it all over again." And as they danced together in their garden, surrounded by the roses and the dreams they had planted together, Alexander Stone knew that his memory had given him the greatest gift of all, not the ability to remember his past, but the wisdom to recognize his future when he found it. Some love stories begin with love at first sight. Others begin with friendship that grows into something deeper. But the most beautiful love stories of all begin with two broken people who choose to heal together, creating something stronger and more precious than either of them could have built alone. Alexander and Zara and Emma Stone lived happily ever after, not because their life was perfect, but because they had learned that perfect families aren't born. They're made, one day at a time, by people who refuse to give up on each other. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the roses were blooming, neighbors reported seeing a family of three dancing in their garden, laughing like people who had discovered the secret to true happiness and decided to share it with the world through the simple act of loving each other completely.